Our next speaker is Terence Ching. He will be speaking on the intersectional insights from an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy training trial. Terence Ching is a US-based Chinese Singaporean, currently completing his PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Connecticut. As a function of his clinical and research training, as well as his personal lived experiences, Terence has academic and clinical interests in the intersections between obsessive-compulsive disorder, stress, trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder, cultural identity and diversity based in race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and also psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Terence has also assumed a sub-investigator co-therapist role in a prior trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, in which he infused the research process with culturally informed recruitment and assessment procedures. Terence is currently working on his doctoral dissertation on a mixed method case study of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD in participants of color, with an emphasis on uncovering new mechanisms of therapeutic change via qualitative analysis. Terence Ching.
Hi, everyone. It's really, really bright up here. So this is my first time doing a talk like this. I get why people look down now, because it's really silly. And I have to confess that I'm pretty nervous right now because, first of all, I've never really done a talk kind of like this. This is my first talk where I'm really speaking quite truthfully about my sexual identity. This is also... Thank you. Still supportive. This is also the first time that I'm... is this a good posture to stand? First time that I will be presenting a talk on psychedelic science, and it's pretty nerve-wracking because I'm in a room of experts and leaders and pioneers in the field, and here I am giving a talk. Because my first foray into psychedelic science happened 2.5 years ago, when my mentor, Dr. Monica Williams, some of you might know her, told me, asked me if I wanted to be a part of the therapist team for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy when MAPS approached her about that. And you know, there were a few reservations about it. I don't know if this is where I want to take my academic career to. I don't know anything about MDMA. Ecstasy, is that it? But you know, it was like a risk that I took, and I clearly remember giving her a fist bump, saying like, we're gonna do this together, and I'm glad that I'm still doing this together with her, under her guidance. Today I'm going to talk about intersectional insights from my experience being trained as a therapist for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. I am speaking from a very personal and individual level. I'm very grateful to be invited here for some Asian representation on the panel, being where we are right now. I will speak only for myself, and I think the goal of my talk is to inspire curiosity about the potential of this form of treatment for many people, queer individuals of color, understanding that there might be limits to my experiences in terms of how it can generalize across individuals. And also, I'm going to be pretty incoherent because I didn't really rehearse this talk well. But I guess, you know, it's going to be an evolution. So I'm going to throw a lot of different bits and pieces of information at you, and hopefully that kind of sticks, but I really want this to set up a premise for what my thought processes were going into the first dosing session for MDMA. And I'm doing this because I'm an academic at heart, and I need to honor that part of myself too. So people in this room know about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. You're here partially because maybe MAPS is one of the sponsoring organizations. They have a booth out there. People are interested about expanded access, and there's a current strong resurgence of interest for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for treating PTSD. Let me know if this stance looks weird on like the camera or something. So in 2017, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy was designated as a breakthrough therapy for really intractable PTSD that hasn't responded to pharmacotherapy or conventional psychotherapy or the combination of the two. At the same time, the findings we have so far are pretty encouraging. Thank you. But Dee was behind before, like she was really tall too. So like, so MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is currently in phase 3 trials. Phase 2 trials had really outstanding findings. We found that approximately 80% of people had pretty sustained recovery from PTSD after the entire process. We found that there was a pretty safe drug profile, and the few adverse events were not entirely related to the medication itself. There were pretty much existing conditions that led to some pretty easily resolvable adverse events. There are also findings of secondary gains in that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy also led to improvements in terms of depressive symptoms, as well as reduced suicidality, as well as reduced substance use. One thing that MAPS really likes to advertise is that most of the participants, when they ask them, they kind of not really want to turn to MDMA again for future use. And that kind of like flew in the face of a lot of the research that kind of said that MDMA as well as the other psychedelic drugs are highly addictive. That if you tried it once, you're going to want to try it again, and that you literally have no control over that. Blah blah blah. The piece of research that really intrigued me was that in the meta-analysis, which is a fancy term for looking at different studies all together, the impact of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treating PTSD was in fact larger than the conventional gold standard treatment for PTSD, which is prolonged exposure. So that was really impressive to me. And it also had really low dropout rates compared to prolonged exposure, which meant that, we're onto something good here. We're managing to keep people in treatment, and we're managing to treat them fully, or as well as we can for as long as we intend to. What isn't helpful so far is that if you're doing MDMA research, maybe a few of the researchers in the room can understand this as well, is that it's typically fraught with a lot of political bias. We all are pretty familiar with the path that MDMA took from initial discovery, synthesis, to its current Schedule I status. We also understand at the academic level or the institutional level that there isn't really a lot of support for doing this kind of research. pretty conservative institutions tend to view such research as not leading to much. There's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape involved in setting up an actual site for research. So it does take a lot of patience and determination to get a study going. And I think a lot of the researchers here in this room can understand that process as well. We also see pretty abysmal rates of inclusion of minorities in these trials. Currently, based on knowledge that I have with accessing the data, of the 100+ participants that were recruited for the phase 2 trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, we know that roughly less than 10%, based on demographic data, were individuals of color. There was, there are plenty of explanations in the literature for this. Maybe there was an inadequate emphasis on diverse recruitment on the part of the researchers. Maybe the methods that they were using were not culturally attuned. Were they informed as to the recruitment needs of communities of color? If you put the word subjects instead of participant in your informed consent form, are communities or individuals of color likely to respond to that favorably, understanding that there are real and that there have been real historical medical atrocities committed against communities of color? We also know that the war on drugs is indeed a racist form of social control. We know that that sets up a very unhealthy attitude toward participating in these trials, especially if you belong to these communities. If your families hear that you are interested in seeking out psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for some of your pretty chronic mental health issues, will that set up further rejection from them? And I say all that to say that we have, in fact, very little to no knowledge about whether this form of treatment works for communities of color, or in fact for queer communities, and more so for queer communities of color. So what I hope to do for the rest of this talk, this thing is just not really staying up, is to share my background. So like I said at the outset, I'm not telling you guys, all my queer folks of color out there, to go ahead and join these trials and participate in them. I'm hoping to provide more information about how things can work throughout this process, having been through this myself. And I want you to understand where I come from and understand maybe some of the limits of my experience in describing your experience, but hopefully that gets some thought going about what it might look like if you were to participate in these trials. And ultimately, my goal is to really demystify and also destigmatize this process for queer folks of color. And I'm open to an ongoing conversation about this after this talk. So who am I? I come from the really small island nation of Singapore. Who's heard of Crazy Rich Asians? That is not representative. In fact, much of the film was filmed outside of Singapore, so that, I just want to put it out there. I was born in Singapore. I've spent time outside of Singapore in many different countries around the world, but I spent most of my life, I would say my formative years, in Singapore. I'm currently now in the United States, and I identify as part of the queer community, specifically a Chinese Singaporean gay male who's cisgender as well. I have many points of privilege, as do many middle-class families in Singapore, and I've noticed how those forms of privilege have shifted depending on the context that I find myself in. So having that as an understanding is also helpful for whether some of these stressors that I'm going to describe would actually apply to you. So where I come from, Singapore, in a short span of 50 odd years, it's managed to become a world leader in terms of education, medicine, infrastructure, and basically architecture, finance, the tourism industry. It's also a worldwide leader in the culinary industry. And it also prides itself on being a multicultural nation. We have 4 predominant races or racial ethnic groups in Singapore: Chinese, Malay, Indian, and, the other. So this is basically people who don't identify as Chinese, Malay, or Indian. So we have conventionally interracial marriages between the early white colonial leaders, as with indigenous families in Singapore, and they produce what we call Eurasians, and we have a lot of intermarriages from people who migrate to the country as well. So Singapore prides itself as a global hub for commerce in the Asian Pacific region. And it attracts a lot of different diverse groups as well, culturally speaking. At the same time, despite its progressive ideals, Singapore is also one of the few countries in the world that criminalizes specifically sexual intercourse between 2 men, even if you don't identify as gay. There is no female equivalent. At the same time, Singapore is also one of the few countries that still enacts and carries out the capital punishment, which is the death penalty, execution by the state for drug trafficking. The threshold amount for presumption of trafficking is 10 grams of MDMA, and the typical amount that makes you, eligible to be executed by the state is 10 times of the threshold amount. So 100 grams of MDMA. To put things into context, 100 grams of MDMA is the typical full dose for approximately 160 participants, according to the MAPS protocol. So the polarity is very jarring, and I come from a country that kind of tips the scale in favor of death versus recovery from pretty chronic mental illness. So I set that up to let you guys understand where I'm coming from when there's institutional and structural stigma against the use of psychedelic and a part of your identity that you can't hope to change. So why did I choose to go ahead with all of this? I think it's, the short answer is pretty fucking cool. It's really cool to do this kind of research. I feel so privileged as a graduate student of color to be able to participate at the forefront of the science. And I think, and just thinking about it further, I think growing up as a sexual minority in Singapore, it compels you to buck social conventions. It compels you to do things differently and to think about things differently. When people say you can't, I say, why not? And you question that. And you have to question it because you have to hang on to something that's close and dear to your heart. It's a part of who you are. And I think that kind of evolved into questioning why I can't pursue this as, a formative part of my academic career. That being said, I did have some hesitation about pursuing this kind of research and going into the therapist training trial and choosing to be administered MDMA for the first time ever in my life. This would be the first time opening up about pretty chronic sexuality stressors to essentially strangers in a formal setting. And this includes very painful memories and experiences of invalidation by people that I love very dearly in my life when they first found out about my sexual orientation. So the fear of rejection is really salient. when, you know, the opportunity arose for me to take part in this trial, it also evoked or triggered the notion of saving face, which is really predominant in my culture. So saving face is a concept within most Asian cultures where you have to portray a very conventional, like, assimilated front to other people in your community so as to protect the integrity and honor of your family's name. And you don't really air your dirty laundry. So the fact that this is recorded, it's kind of like, you know. So saving face and not airing dirty laundry is really important where I come from. So that was something to grapple with too. So I'm sure a lot of my Asian, you know, brothers and sisters of color out there, you know, you understand this notion. And then I'm also thinking, how much do these therapists who don't belong to my culture, how much do they know about the stresses that I go through being gay in an Asian family? Will they be able to empathize? Or will I be left to work through some of these really vulnerable and you know, traumatic issues on my own, being left all out alone in the wild, in a highly vulnerable state under the influence of MDMA? Will this like be re-traumatizing for me to not again receive support for my sexual identity? So those are really questions that I had, and I was like really grateful and thankful that I managed to work through these questions with my therapists. It also was really helpful that earlier components of my training had a lot of destigmatizing education about the effects of MDMA, that it facilitated a very conducive state to work through some traumatic memories without being overwhelmed by the fear and anxiety, blah, blah, blah. You guys know all this. What really worked for me was that my therapists believed me, and they did so unquestioningly. So that was very corrective for me. I know Alex Belzer talked about this, how we should question the male-female dyad, but he also mentioned how the dyad needs to be catering to the specific needs of a client. So for me to receive parental invalidation in my past and to have a male-female dyad in front of me compassionately and unquestioningly accepting me for who I am and what I choose to tell them was very corrective for me. So maybe this is a particular scenario in which the male-female dyad might be helpful. It was also very powerful because Marcella is my female therapist. Some of you might know her. She's done a lot of the original work with these trials. And it was very helpful being seen and heard as a queer person of color in a white heteronormative society by a female therapist of color. I will also say that, you know, the prep sessions kind of facilitated a very holistic healing environment for me. So my care did not just reside in the room that I was in for therapy sessions, but it also extended outside of these rooms to being, you know, chauffeured to and from the therapy room, being set up at a place of the colleague of these therapists who catered to my every need and made me feel like I was deserving of care, most importantly. And I think that holistic healing environment was very important and can be very important for people who don't feel cared for in today's society. So all of these thought processes and all of these factors kind of set up a really good setting for my first dosing session with MDMA. And I will, you know, this is where things get a little incoherent because, you know, I'm sharing things that are personal and I haven't quite, you know, again, rehearsed this talk, but in the initiation phase, when the MDMA was handed over to me in a ceremonial cup, and a candle was lit to accompany my journey, and flowers were set up next to me, it felt like a very holistic environment for therapeutic work. And it was very inviting, and it was very sacred, and it really made me feel really cared for in that moment. The choice of music is something that is discussed very little in the literature. I would say that, their suggestion of shamanic drumming music to help ease myself into the process was very helpful, because it sort of facilitated this experience of sort of like cocoon-like experience of me having my own arms reaching out from within me to kind of like envelope me and form like a really protective cocoon for me to start my journey. So this is actually one of the few art pieces that I had drawn after my experience as part of my integration. And there you might see that I was already like holding my arms like this, but I clearly had the experience of my own arms reaching out from within me to kind of envelope me to form a protective cocoon for the start of my journey. Another theme I want to talk about was cultural pride, and I'll share some images that made me achieve some insights that are related to this theme. So, recurrently, I would find myself in a vast desert, and I would be walking, like exploring the environments, and it was like fantastical, and I've never been in a desert out alone before, coming from a small island nation of Singapore. And I would also recurrently encounter a tapir, whatever, however you want to call it. So this is an animal that is indigenous to Africa, to Southeast Asia, and it is a very symbolic cultural icon for me. And sometimes I would just see it walking about, and sometimes I would walk alongside it. Sometimes I would look at it, and it will look at me. And I had this recurrent thought about it being lost out in the desert, that this is not where it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be back in the lush jungles of Southeast Asia, where it has food and water. And I just felt sorry for it, and I really wanted to be able to guide it back to where it belongs. Elsewhere, I would encounter the Rafflesia, which is the world's largest flower. It is better known by its other name, corpse flower, because of its pungent odor. It smells like rotten flesh. It is huge, as you can see, and I would recurrently encounter a giant Rafflesia, and I was not really deterred because, obviously I don't have that odorous barrier. I pulled closer to it, and I was magically able to transform myself into like a minuscule homunculus-like figure. And I jumped into the center of the flower, and I managed to, I just found myself dancing within it. And it was strange because I could see all these spores just like floating around me. And I was just in the middle of it all, and I was just dancing. And one thing you should know is that these sessions were recorded, so I had a chance to like look back on my sessions, and it was crazy to just see myself narrating these things to my therapists. But the main insights that I got from these were that because they are such symbolic icons of my culture, of my Southeast Asian roots, that it really, in a very obvious way, made me know that I need to remember my cultural roots, where I come from, no matter where I find myself, and that I should always embrace them, even though they can be pretty repulsive to the Western eye. that I should always embrace even the strangest parts of those icons that really represent where I come from, in a pretty fearless way. So I say this to say that, like, there can be cultural stereotypes in American society where certain foods that certain cultures consume might be perceived as repugnant. And it also really sets up this stereotype of, one can easily remember, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States, Chinese people eating weird things, blah, blah, blah. It sets up this, notion that what we come to perceive as repugnant now is really through the lens of the Western colonizer, and that we need to be able to understand why, maybe certain cultural groups eat certain things. It's because it's important to them. It's because they respect the whole animal. Oh, wow. And I just lost my train of thought. There is an important reason, and that reason is not always obvious to people who belong to mainstream society, and that it is in these moments that you really need to honor your cultural roots and remember where you came from. I just really want to quickly move on to the next theme, which is LGBTQIA plus pride. A lot of experiences, so I had a lot of recurrent experiences with very fantastical environments and beings. I clearly remember a neon purple hedgehog emanating from my chest as my spirit guide. It was funny because when I said that, Marcella pulled out her phone and, started Googling about what a hedgehog meant. And what she found was that, it was maternal. It was gentle, it was nurturing, it was also protective, and also really resilient, and it could, resist toxins of a certain snake that was its, predator, etc. So it's also pretty darn cute. And also I saw it, like emanating out of my chest, and I identified that as my spirit guide, and it did accompany me throughout the rest of my journey. And it led me to encounter a giant horseshoe crab in the bottom of the ocean. For some reason, I was at the bottom of the ocean too, but I was not suffocating or drowning. That had a giant mermaid's tail appended to the top of its shell, where it was like swishing about. And it was shining all kinds of iridescent colors into the water. And it compelled me to look deeper into the shimmering iridescence. And when I was washed over with, this rainbow of colors, I could see that there were no clear boundaries separating one hue from the other, that it was seamless and easy to transition from one hue to the other if I desired. And what that meant to me was that, it is important to find comfort knowing that I am unique as these, hybrid creatures, and that my lived experiences need not conform to hard boundaries set by today's society, that all of the boundaries that society kind of sets between this is being red and this is purple, this is blue, are kind of false. And they can fall away if you let them, and that you can affirm yourself even if you're not out. And I say this because coming out really is a Western idea. That coming out is more of a process where I come from, that there isn't really a declarative coming out moment for a lot of people in my culture. That is really subtle, and it takes place over a prolonged period of time. And in that prolonged period of time, if you don't affirm your own sexual identity, no one will do it for you. So that really drove home the message for me as well. The next thing I want to cover is intersectionality and just how I came to accept that. And I would narrate this with, again, a lot of images. It was funny because I had one of the most images that my therapist had encountered. So it was cool too, to know that I was giving them a lot. So I would just be on a really vast green field, and I would see from afar a giant brown stallion galloping toward me, but there was something really weird attached to its tail. That instead of a tail, it had the body of a crocodile attached to it. And the horse was visibly agitated, and the crocodile was kind of like snapping at its heels. So my thought to myself was like, they obviously have to work that out because that's not going to work for them. And like every now and then there would be like a giant warm ray of sunshine that shone brightly, and that would compel the hybrid creature to kind of like come to a stop and then rest. And in that moment, the horse would graze, and the crocodile would kind of like curl up on its back and bask in the sunlight. And then this kind of like sets up a pattern where, they would do this whole thing again, and they would come to a stop, do this whole thing again, come to a stop, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden, I saw them actually dissolve in a whirlpool of colors, and in its place appeared a full-length mirror. And, that I was, intrigued, and I walked closer to it, and I could see myself in the mirror, and I could see within my body slowly appearing the Chinese characters for fire on the left and wood on the right. So they are represented in their Chinese characters in their elemental form. So the character for fire is burning bright, and the character for wood has like textured bark-like texture on it. And slowly they would come together, slowly overlapping but not burning each other out. And it's beautiful because, as you can see, the Chinese characters for these words are pretty similar. Right? They are the opposite elemental forms of each other, but they can coexist. And this really, compelled me to understand that sometimes the fact that you are intersectional doesn't mean that you are always accepting of every part of you. That sometimes you need to hold the mirror up to your conflicts of allegiances. That if you're in, with your family, you can feel homophobia more. And sometimes if you're in the LGBTQ community and among your peers, you can feel racism more. You have to understand that you are intersectional, and everyone here is intersectional depending on, what you choose to identify with. That you can coexist with every part of you, even though it can get challenging at times. The last thing I want to share is, concepts of patience, perspective, and retrospection. So it did take a long time for me. My experience was 2 years ago, and here I am giving this talk. So it took a long time for me to formulate the themes and bring them together and have some deeper level of understanding for them and integrate them into my life moving forward. I would say that throughout my experiences, I was freely able to shrink down in size and, grow up to be a giant. And having that flexibility in perspective was important to me, and it made me realize that sometimes all I needed to do was take a step back from what was really troubling me to understand that there can be, oh my God, I just burped into the mic. To understand that there can be, pretty difficult moments in your life But if you were willing to take a step back and see things from the bigger picture, that there are things in your life worth celebrating and being proud of as well. At the end of my journey, I saw people like this. I saw in the sky, in the afterglow of the setting sun in the desert sky, a giant clock saying 9:04, and which was coincidentally the start time of my MDMA experience, which kind of like made me realize that any time really is MDMA time. And I say that more so to suggest that with this experience, you can always look back on it, that you can always introspect and retrospect about what you achieved from this experience, and that you can use the insights from this experience to make meaning of future challenges in your life as a way, an ongoing way to integrate, whatever comes after this experience. So I know that I'm running short on time, and I want to end here, and I really want to say a big thank you to Maps and Marcella and Bruce, my therapists, as well as Monica and all the people who have been in my life, you guys, Bia and the crew, and I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to share my experiences with you guys. $125 plus 60, I think. So a little under 200.
Hello. I just wanted to give a huge compliment to you. You killed it.
Thanks.
And I really appreciate your authenticity, your vulnerability, and your humor. And also, I wanted to thank Chacruna for having Asian representation on the panel. It really, 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 really means a lot to me for Asian representation on the panel. I'm getting really teary-eyed about it. Because we're not the same Asian, but...
Right. We're not all the same.
Yeah, we're not the same. But I'm really nervous about my future career in psychedelic research, because it's mostly white.
Yeah.
So I'm really nervous about it. So it really means a lot to me. But I wanted to ask, did you find any barriers, political barriers at least, in the research team because of your minority status?
I'm fortunate to be part of a team that's very focused on the cultural aspects of the psychedelic treatment process. So I would say that is a privilege. And I also, at the same time, hear a lot of researchers, therapists, and aspiring therapists who find themselves in a lot of white spaces, a lot of heteronormative spaces, who don't feel safe to say that they want more of a focus on the needs that you as a therapist understand that your clients of color need. I would say that as broadly Asian individuals, we suffer from the stereotype that we're not assertive enough. And I really want to challenge you to break that stereotype, even though it feels awkward at times, even if you have to use humor to ease into it, that it's worth it at the end, because you have to, I feel personally compelled to challenge that stereotype. And, just the fact that you decided to speak up was a great first step, and I want to validate that. And I think I think we're more capable than just math and science, right? So, yeah. And I'm glad I didn't get into math school, so.
Again, I want to do a big shout out to Dr. Monica Williams. She's in our advisory board, and she's a really kick-ass woman, and she's an inspiration to all of us. And we're co-organizing a special journal edition about access and racial equity. And I wanted to ask you something, and I felt very identified with what you said about like coming out being like a Western thing. And I would like you to talk more about this two different ways. Because usually I always said that, you know, I'm Brazilian and Aline is here. I think she can talk too. Like for us, it's different. But then in the US, there is this thing that is political that you should do it. And I've always struggled with it. And, you know, I've been pushed to that place. And I think there is something powerful on that. And
Yeah.
I would like to know what you feel about all of this. And also you say this is your first time. So how does the first time feel for you?
I'll find out after I see this up. So I would say that, you know, it is a process for many different people. The Western, I would say the American ideal is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm open to suggestions, that coming out is a definitive point in time. It's a rite of passage for a lot of queer individuals. And it's also a privilege that isn't quite enjoyed in certain communities of color. I would say cultural standards of parenting might be a major factor in that. I would say the relationships you have with your family, if you have more of a say in the family versus, you know, if you have to do everything that your elders say, and that means, and that kind of includes concealing your sexual identity, also has a role to play in that. But for me, you know, like coming out is more of a process than anything. I don't think I've ever had a moment in time where I definitively told my parents that I was gay. And so fingers crossed they don't see this. But again, you know, like knowing that, and I'm still saying this and allowing this to be recorded, means that part of me wants that moment to happen. But as much as we want that moment to happen, it doesn't always play out the same way. So we can't have that expectation of it playing out the same way because you come from a different background than I do. And you have certain privileges that I might not enjoy being in a family that I have. So understanding that everyone has a process to coming out, and that might vary in terms of duration, etc. For you, it might have been, you know, a forced moment of coming out. For some people, that might have been too. But, you know, it bears knowing that there can be incredible variance in that process for you, depending on what barriers there are. So hopefully, you know, that's a lot of different words and information. So.
I just want to say thank you also as well as for the other attendee who expressed appreciation for the visibility and representation of you being here. And I appreciate that as an Asian American male. I was curious, I know you briefly touched about this, just about how do family members, parents ask you what you do? And because I know as an Asian American, I don't want to generalize for other folks too, but they're like, you know, oh, what do you do? And it's like, I could see you saying, oh, I have a PhD. Like, whoa. Yeah. And that's very impressive. But then do they ask, like, what do you do? And yeah, you know what I mean? Yeah, how do you respond to that?
They are more concerned about whether I'm finishing my classes, or my mom sends me reminders about exams that I don't go to because those aren't real. But I don't think I've specifically told them that I'm doing MDMA-Assisted Psychotherapy. They might have read that somewhere because my mom likes to snoop on things I do. So she's definitely seen that term, and she lives in Singapore. So, you know, she's letting me do my thing. There's some flexibility around that. And I would say that, you know, that may be a byproduct of this kind of like don't ask, don't tell policy saving face, cultural factor there, where, if we don't discuss your sexuality, then we can kind of deny its existence. So there's that too. But I'm sure she's proud of me. Well, she's gonna have to be. I mean, I'm who I am, so. Does this look weird? Because I did this for like 70%.
According to Grey's Anatomy, when you stand like that, it's like confidence boosting, and the brain surgeons especially.
But a lot
like
of
to do
that research has been debunked, though. Like,
oh well, okay. you can perhaps choose to believe the placebo effect and just like lean into the good space of that.
I will take that. Thank you for that.
Hi, thank you so much for all that you've done and are currently doing, and for being so open and vulnerable today. I wanted to ask you specifically about your MDMA experience. It sounded like it was really visual, like visually immersive, and that's like, I didn't think that about MDMA, and I'm curious if in your use or in the research, if that's a common phenomenon for people, like lots of internal visual space. Yes, that's my question.
I actually don't know if fellow participants have as rich, in terms of an experience in terms of visual imagery. I will say that my intuition is that MDMA kind of capitalizes on your strengths. So if you're a highly creative individual with the potential to generate visual images, and if that's the modality that you kind of process things in, maybe that's a strength that MDMA plays on, and it enhances that. I would say for like a lot of other classic entheogens, such as like psilocybin, people can have pretty culturally focused experiences where a lot of their icons of their cultural past and icons of their upbringing get played out in a very kaleidoscopic way. So there's always like opportunities for visual imagery rich experiences depending on the substance of choice. But for me it was so, and I think that might have been why. I do know of other participant accounts of, more of a feeling-based journey, more of an introspective journey than anything, more of like an emotive journey than anything. So I think there's huge variance in that, and I think that's great because there's diversity in experiences, and it really taps into what's really significant to you.
I just had a quick question. Did they use any sort of psychotherapy, like specific form of psychotherapy when you were doing that, when you were on your journey?
MAPS has the protocol as inner directed. So if anything, it's not like cognitive behavior therapy. It's nothing entirely directive. It's more guided than anything. It's more of a intentional sitting experience and supportive unfurling of the experience with the participant than anything. So the term that they like to use is inner directed. Whether, there's like cultural loadedness with that term is important. Monica talks about this sometimes too, like, would we like it to be inner directed with some African American communities as opposed to like higher being directed, etc. So like understanding that, inner directed is a term coined by predominantly white researchers is also important to know, like if this is culturally sensitive too. But, if anything, it's not directed. It's not like, okay, let's have you think about this intentionally.
Just want to say a hi from Monica that is here on the phone, and remind you all that MAPS has an opening for a therapist training program that is going to happen in the East Coast, and also a nice workshop in Kentucky, in
Louisville.
Yeah, so maybe you can get information with him or out in the table. Also want to say that Chacruna was invited to be co-sponsor of a panel on Pioneers that is a very big and mainstream conference, and they invited us to make a panel about sexual diversities and minorities and inclusion. And so, this kind of thing gives me a lot of hope, because it's like you do the work and the result is immediate. So I want to encourage everybody that is having existential issues about whether they want to follow this career or not. And I liked the rhetoric and performativity of what you said. I also want to, present the other side, that if you join this path and do this career as a life choice, there's so many potentialities and there's so much to be built. And what is nice about doing a kind of field that is a little bit edgy and weird and stigmatized is that there's so little done. Everything you do really matters. And you get to see the results of your action very fast. Like, you constantly have this feeling that you're making history, because you create one thing and that immediately affects this little field and builds into another, so it's very vibrant. So especially to all the young people that are like, should I stay or should I go? I say you should go. There's a lot of space and we need a lot of help, and there's much to build. And I thank you all again, and I really appreciate your talk as well. Very beautiful. I almost cried. I'm going to pass on to Christy. Big applause to you.
Thank you.